Good afternoon. We're at the United States Naval Academy Museum in Preble Hall with Lincoln Paine. This lecture series is funded by the Class of 1950 Museum Endowment in recognition of the significant contribution made to the endowment by the Scheifele Trust, named after Vice Admiral Ralph Scheifele, who was a highly decorated naval aviator and a graduate of the Naval Academy Class of 1933. Lincoln Paine is the author of 5 books and more than 50 articles, reviews, and lectures on maritime history. His books include The Sea and Civilization, A Maritime History of the World, published by Knopf in October 2013, Down East, A Maritime History of Maine, and Ships of the World in a Historical Encyclopedia, as well as Beyond the Dead White Whales, Literature of the Sea and Maritime History. He serves on the boards of the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, one of the top 10 maritime museums
in the world.
Yep. And of the Telling Room, a nonprofit writing center for children and young adults in Portland. He and his wife live in Portland, and their daughters happen to be named for ships. And since we are at the Naval Academy, I know our midshipmen will be disappointed that your daughters are not named Bonhomme Richard, Monitor, Enterprise, Saratoga. I'm going to start with a quote. It's from John F. Kennedy when he was in Newport, Rhode Island in 1962. I really don't know why it is that all of us are so committed to the sea, except I think it's because, in addition to the fact that the sea changes and the light changes and ships change, it's because we all came from the sea. And it's an interesting biological fact that all of us have in our veins the exact same percentage of salt in our blood that exists in the ocean. And therefore, we have salt in our blood, in our sweat, and in our tears. We are tied to the ocean. And when we go back to the sea, whether it is to sail or to watch it, we are going back from whence we came. Lincoln, based on your book, is John Kennedy's quote as valid for civilizations as it is for individuals?
Well, I think that civilizations have certainly emerged from the sea. I don't know that they necessarily have to go back to it to revive themselves, although it certainly helps. And if you want to have a culture that expands, generally speaking, it expands most quickly and efficiently over the sea and by water.
There are some civilizations that have had greater advantages than others in developing the sea.
Well, the ones that are that emerge near the sea, obviously, proximity is a big advantage, but it's not the only one. And if you look at the ancient civilizations that we generally think about, Egypt, the Mesopotamian civilizations in China, and the Indus Valley civilization in what's now Pakistan, those civilizations actually grew up on rivers. And I'm very careful in the book to address the fact that I think that rivers are fundamental to any sort of maritime history of the world, or any nation's maritime history, because they are extensions of the sea, if you will, and allow people to go inland in areas that they otherwise would not. And if you look at some of the great cities of the world, Paris and London, for instance, or St. Louis, even Pittsburgh, these are all riverine cities. Chicago also grew up on the lake and its access to the Illinois River and the Mississippi. So rivers are fundamentally important to the development of civilizations. And being able to be near the sea, if you have the capacity and you have the drive, whether that's economic or military or expansionist, ideological, to use the sea, then yes, being near the sea does confer some advantages.
Why did you write the book?
Well, when Clifford Ashley wrote his Book of Knots back in the 1940s, he has a wonderful line. He says that the urge to write a book is nowadays regarded as ample excuse for almost any delinquency. And I think that was part of the urge. But I've always been interested in maritime history and the sea, and I grew up being interested in it because of things like maritime museums, like this wonderful museum that we're in today. I grew up in New York, and when I was about 10 was the founding of South Street Seaport, and I spent a lot of time hanging around down there. But the period that I grew up in, the early 70s, was really when I sort of, was a teenager. It was a very interesting period in maritime history, in world maritime history, because in Manhattan, where I lived, all of the piers that had ringed the island and that were across the river in New Jersey or in Brooklyn were beginning to be abandoned and to decay and to fall apart, and literally basically subside back into the mud. And the reason for that, of course, was two things. The first was the development of the passenger jet, which basically knocked the legs out from under transatlantic shipping instantaneously. And the second, of course, was containerization, which did the same thing in the same period in forcing containerized shipping to move out to sort of desolate, otherwise barren lands like Port Elizabeth in New Jersey. So you had two completely distinct technologies, one very maritime, one completely non-maritime, both of which contributed to the basically eradication of what had been this maritime culture, vibrant maritime culture in New York City. And so I began to get very interested in that and its implications for the way the city worked as an urban space. And also I was involved later in tall ship events. In 1976, I worked for OpSail for the bicentennial. And then I worked with sail training programs. So I was always involved sort of peripherally in various types of maritime enterprise. But I was a classicist by training. At least that's what you're supposed to say. I'm not sure if I trained. And if I did train, I would never have actually made the team. But in any event, I spent a lot of time reading Latin and Greek history in college. And so I tend to have a longer sort of baseline, if you will, of where I think history kind of starts, or where my starting point for history was. And I kept feeling that there were all these sort of missing pieces when people talked about maritime history, because it seemed so centered on 20th century concerns or 19th century concerns, so oriented towards the British and the American experience. And I kept thinking there's got to be a way to sort of get beyond that. And so over time, after I did Ships of the World, the historical encyclopedia, that gave me sort of a skeleton of a maritime history, but it was a very lopsided one because it focused on Western ships and generally more modern ships, because all the ships that I include are named vessels. So it wasn't about types of vessels, it was about actual ships that people had heard of. So I thought, well, maybe now's the time to try to write a maritime history of the world.
Getting back to your studying Latin and Greek history, one of the things that I always try to stress with my naval history students are sources. Mm-hmm. Go to the library, work with I know we have a number of librarians and special collections here. Can you tell us about the sources that you use, particularly with the early sections of this book? That must have been incredibly difficult when you're talking about, region, whether it's the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean thousands of years ago.
It is. And one of the things I hope that the book achieves is to sort of give other people who've come along and are interested in this kind of thing sort of a baseline to start from, and a sort of a foundation of sources to look at and to proceed from, and to explore in greater depth than I could. So there are a variety of things. For the Americas, for instance, and for the Oceania, which constitute basically this focus of the first chapter, a lot of what I did had to do with ethnography, archaeology, folklore, and trying to piece all of those sort of different strands together. So I spent a lot of time looking at journals and reading obscure books, and it was fairly academically oriented. And relying also on the very earliest explorers' accounts of what they encountered when they came to what they thought of as the New World. For Egypt, there's considerably more material available. One of the great sources is a thing by a guy named Breasted, who was a scholar at the University of Chicago, and did a 6, I think, volume source book of Egyptian writings. And I plowed through that pretty heavily, and it was extremely rewarding, because although we think of Egypt as being sort of a desert culture, it really has an incredible amount of maritime connection. It's got about 24 incredibly well-preserved ships from about 5,000 to 3,000 years old. It has innumerable models and tomb paintings, and it's got a really robust poetic and narrative literature that talks about maritime culture. So that was a fairly easy piece to work with, because there's a lot of literature written about that. It's also fairly easy to do the ancient Mediterranean, because it's such a field that so many people have gone over so many times. Lots of archaeological evidence to work from. There's obviously people who are interested in Greece and Rome, and also people interested in the biblical communities. So there's a lot of material to work with there. You slip east of Suez and everything changes. There are maybe, I'm not sure if there are any archaeological remains of boats in the Indian Ocean littoral before 1500.
Why is that?
Well, they either haven't been found, they're enormously well hidden, or the environment just isn't conducive to the preservation of historic vessels because of the organic material. The fact that they tended to be, we think, and the evidence of there being none to look at seems to suggest that they were actually mostly sewn boats. So when the cordage came rotted, everything sort of fell apart and floated away. And I think there's also in the written record, the problem is that people in the Indian Ocean don't think about writing and recording the same sorts of things that Westerners have grown up thinking about writing and recording. And so they tend to be less data-driven. And if you look at the amount of historical literature in the West that is data-driven, it's really kind of remarkable. But then you go east of Suez and it's the Ramayana, and you've got some amazing epics, Tamil epics, and Sanskrit, and fantastic stories which have not yet been really explored by people using the tools of Western scholarship to look at what they have to say about the sea and seafaring. So in fact, there are some translations that I use in the book, which I'm almost embarrassed to have used because they're 19th century and they get to words for ships or boats of some type, and they use very archaic phrasing, and you think, this can't possibly be right. Mm-hmm. But it's as close as we can get until people start actually going back and combing through those texts for very particular purposes, the way, say, Lionel Casson went through ancient Greek and Roman literature to look at what they had written about ships.
Was that the greatest challenge of writing this book? I wanted to talk a little bit about the procedure of writing the book before we get into some other issues. Mm-hmm. But was it the lack of sources for specific regions that was that greatest challenge
Specific
for you?
Sources for particular regions and for particular time periods.
What's the earliest example of man using the sea?
Well, the peopling of Australia took place 50,000 years ago. And according to all of the available evidence that I've been able to find, and everything I've seen written about the earliest settlement of Australia, that could only have taken place by people traveling from greater Southeast Asia, which at that point was largely connected in a singular landmass, and hopping the water barrier between that and Greater Australia, which at that time included not only the island of Australia, but New Guinea and Tasmania. And it was only after the sea levels began to rise that New Guinea and Australia were separated, and then Tasmania as well. But that all of the evidence is that people first got to Australia 50,000 years ago, and it could only have been by water. Now, whether it was watercraft or not is a very interesting question, and it hasn't been satisfactorily resolved. One of the things I just read about, I think it was in a book review in the Times this weekend, is how sort of the diaspora of plants and animals around the world across very great distances, even sort of post-Pangea, but when South Africa or South America and Africa were only 900 miles apart. And one of the theories is that's advanced is that there were these enormous rafts of vegetation and trees and stuff that would detach from the landmass and just float, these floating islands, literally. And we don't tend to see those anymore because we do a really good job, thanks to the Army Corps of Engineers and others, of really sprucing up our rivers and stripping away anything that is an impediment to navigation. But it's conceivable to me, having read this book, that perhaps that is one way that people got to Australia, which kind of knocks the wind out of the sails of the theory that people were actually going to sea deliberately. But even if we take that as being, too far back, 15,000 years ago seems to be a pretty safe bet.
In the, say, 10 to 50,000 year range, or since then, has there been, in your research, a commonality between all those civilizations on why they went to sea? Or were there any differences?
Yes, there are differences, and there are some commonalities. It's hard to say what drives people to go to sea. Obviously, the urge to travel for whatever reason is the most basic one, because traveling by water is the most efficient way and usually the safest in a lot of respects. Remember, when you go on land, you have to not only deal with the sort of unforgiving terrain of the land, which does not have interstates in its natural state, and you have to also deal with people who, in their smaller tribal communities and unadvanced senses of identity, tend to not be terribly friendly to outsiders. And even if they are accepting of outsiders, they like to do things like tax them, and they're very protectionist. So there are all sorts of reasons that traveling by land is not that easy, and traveling by water is. If we look at the question of seasonality, everybody sort of now thinks of water, sort of you get boat insurance that starts in May and ends in October, and the rest of the year you don't want to go sailing. But before the development of the macadam roadway, spring in the northern hemisphere was a terrible time to travel because the road just turns to mush, or the ground turns to mush. So people didn't really travel much in the spring. So seasonal transportation obtained on land as well as on sea. So the use of the sea was fundamental as just sort of an option to get around. Why people went to sea is probably no different from why people left their homes on land. Expansionist tendencies, a desire to trade, a desire to acquire goods that you needed to sustain yourself or your community, and as a way to attack other people, either because that was your sort of primary objective or in retribution for a perceived wrong. So those are the reasons people go to sea. I think that we tend to ask that question with a sort of more mystical, anticipating a kind of more wondrous answer. But I think really people go to sea for very pragmatic reasons. Yes, maybe we're drawn back there because our blood is the same salt chemistry as the ocean, but I don't know. That's not what I feel when I go to the beach, certainly. Sometimes I feel, warm and I feel pleasant and it's nice, but other times it's wet and dreary and sort of a pain in the neck. And there are lots of people who would never go to sea if they didn't have to. So ambition is a big driver, proximity is a big driver, but I don't think that there's you can't sort of point to one cause.
Steam is probably one of the greatest technological innovations in history that changed the global maritime commons. In the research for the sea and civilization, what were some of the other technological advancements, not necessarily from Western Europe, but other regions of the world?
Well, certainly the sail was of fundamental importance, and that's definitely not a Western European invention. Or even a European invention. The oldest evidence for sails we have is about 7,000 years ago, and it comes from the Persian Gulf. Really, the model in question comes from what's now Kuwait. The oldest pictorial evidence of a sail is only 5,500 years old, and that comes from Egypt. And what's fascinating about the Egyptian example is that it comes from a big amphora called the Gerzian or the Nakada jar, which is named for a place on the Nile River upstream from Cairo. And the dating of it is very important because the Nile runs from south to north, and that's the direction of the prevailing current. And it is possible to row or to paddle against the current. But it gets progressively more difficult depending on the time of year because of the floods and so on. The prevailing wind, however, blows from north to south. So if you could harness the wind to go against the current, you would really be in a very advantageous position. So around 3,200 years ago, give or take, we have the evidence of the sail on a ship on the Nile from what is now, or what was then, or what is called Upper Egypt. And at that time, there was an Upper Egypt, which was relatively wealthy, and there was a Lower Egypt to the north around the Delta, which was relatively poor, but still fairly sophisticated compared to its neighbors. Around the same time that we have this evidence of the sail, we also find the evidence of the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And why would that have been possible at that time? Well, why that would have been possible is because we suddenly have the sail that allows us to use the Nile River as a corridor of transportation with relative ease. And so whoever has sails can now command the waters and command the land that surrounds the Nile. And so there, I think, is the very earliest, very clear-cut example of sailing and maritime technology having a direct, immediate impact on the development of human society and civilization. So that's my answer to that question.
Whether you're writing a doctoral dissertation, an article, or a book, there are always these, during the course of your research, there's always these aha moments that you didn't expect. What did you find in the course of your research that you didn't expect to find for this?
The most interesting thing that comes up in the book again and again, and I didn't put it there because I have an axe to grind about it, is the immediate relationship between commerce and religion. And I'd read about this, but I hadn't really thought about it very much. But as I started writing the book and researching the book, again and again, the evidence for maritime expansion and maritime trade and maritime developments, particularly in old sources from antiquity and elsewhere, religion comes up again and again. And you find religious merchants, religious monks and priests sailing with merchants on merchant ships, following merchants' routes, transplanting their religion from place to place. You find this in the very earliest texts alluding to Indian monks going to China or Chinese monks going to India in as early as the 5th, 6th centuries. Then you find it again with the expansion of Christianity in the early centuries of Christianity. So in the 4th century, you find Christian merchants bringing Christianity down the Red Sea to what is now Eritrea and Ethiopia, 500 years before Christianity was taken to Denmark. And when you find Christianity taken to Denmark in the 8th century by St. Ansgar, you find that the people who are on the receiving end of this new religion, are saying, well, gosh, maybe we should let them build a church here because this would be a really big advantage because these Christians have a lot of stuff. And if we adopt Christianity, we can trade with them and they'll want to trade with us. And so that would be a good thing. And Thor, Odin, Freya, we don't need them. We can just become Christians. Again, with Islam, you find the transmission of Islam sailing out of the Persian Gulf in the 1st century of Islam, going to establish communities in places all along the Indian coast, eventually in Southeast Asia, and then in China. And one of my favorite stories in the book is actually about a 9th century Muslim sailor, Persian probably, named Ismail, who sails from the Persian Gulf, and he's going down to the coast of East Africa. And he gets blown off course, and he winds up in a place on the coast of what's probably Mozambique. And he goes ashore, and he takes a bunch of slaves, 200 slaves. And the king, or the local ruler, comes down to his ship and comes on board and says, well, I just wanted to say goodbye. And he's got his retinue of people there, and the captain telling the story says, well, I took a look at the king and I took a look at his retainers, and I thought, well, we could fetch a fair penny for these guys, and off they go back to Oman. So the king is sold into slavery, and he makes his way to Baghdad under his new owner, and then he goes on pilgrimage to Mecca with his owner, and he escapes, and he goes to Egypt. And then he decides he wants to go home, so he makes his way up the Nile and to the coast, and he finally winds up back on the throne in his old country. And lo and behold, if Ismail doesn't show up with his ship because he's discovered this is a good place to trade, and he's brought before the king, and imagine his chagrin, because he thought he'd seen the last of this guy in the slave market in Oman. And the king says, oh, well, fancy meeting you here. I'm not going to kill you, though, because you were responsible for bringing me my religion and for me bringing Islam to my people. And for that, we are very grateful. So when you go, as you will, all I ask is that you tell your fellow merchants that we are Muslims like themselves. And fundamentally, it's basically like them hanging out a sign saying Arabic spoken here. And so that is, one of these great stories about the transmission of religion on the heels of commerce. And then, of course, you have, the sort of historically crazy situation of Christianity being the dominant religion of North and South America. And it's crazy only if, you don't know the story of how Christianity jumped across the Atlantic, but it was obviously on the backs of merchants.
Of all the countries and the civilizations you explore in this book, which one used the maritime environment comparatively the best in terms of its eventual growth?
Well, it's always difficult to answer that kind of question because we look at things that grow and then we kind of ignore their demise. So, but to give you sort of a straightforward answer, I think Rome did a very good job of using the Mediterranean and sea power in its conquests of Gaul, in its conquests of Britain, in its preservation of the Rhine-Danube border against the barbarians who lived north of that, and certainly in keeping Rome afloat as a city with the annona and the grain trade from Egypt and from North Africa. So they, I think, really deserve the highest marks. What's interesting, of course, is that people tend to think, if they think about it at all, that Rome was sort of a landlocked empire and that the Romans didn't like the sea and that really we should look at the Greeks. And yes, the Rhodians were very good at this. The Athenians were, they had a very good, very, very brief run of about 30 or 40 years when they sort of ruled the roost from the Battle of Salamis up till the end of the 5th century. But I don't think they were I think they overplayed their hand in deliberate and bad ways. The British Empire obviously was fundamentally a maritime one, but they also overreached, and the unwinding of the British Empire, when you compare the unwinding to how long it took to get to where it was, say, in 1939, was remarkably fast. But I would say those are the examples that I would point to.
China is certainly an interesting topic in the news with disputes in the South China Sea and elsewhere.
Hadn't heard that.
And even in our classes. I was wondering if you could discuss its role its maritime role in history. And I think back for perspective, there's a very brief battle you mentioned. And I know I'm mispronouncing the word. It's Geum, maybe Geum River, in 633, in which the Japanese lost 400 ships to a Chinese fleet of 170. I think we tend to forget that China did have a maritime history. And I was wondering if you could just briefly, in a few minutes, talk about thousands of years of Chinese maritime history.
Well, yes, of course. Nothing like a good synopsis to wind up. Well, first of all, about the battle. Basically, as far as I know, that's pretty much what we know. That there were 150 Chinese units of floating things versus 400 units of Japanese floating things. Whether they should be called ships, whether there was any parity in terms of size, all of these are sort of questions we don't know. They could have been much larger Chinese vessels versus really tiny little Japanese things. But if you're just sort of counting and saying everything's an apple, then yes, the Chinese overwhelmed the Japanese fleet. I think more likely that the case is that the Chinese just had bigger vessels and the Japanese were overwhelmed. The Chinese have had a very interesting relationship with the sea for a very long time. Part of it's a geographical problem, part of it is an ideological problem, or let's say geography and ideology have influenced China's relationship with the sea as a sort of conceit, which is to say that if you look at the peopling of Oceania starting about 3,500 years ago, it seems that the ancestors of the people who settled Oceania, and indeed much of Southeast Asia, started in what is now southern China, the coastal provinces of southern China. And that is to say that the people who lived there were not the Han Chinese of the northwest regions, which were essentially nomadic and lived in much more oriented towards Central Asia. Their preoccupation was with people who were on their land borders and who were constantly threatening them. But that was the heartland, the Han heartland of China. It was very territorial, very continental. They gradually absorbed the territory of the 100 Yue, who lived in the southern parts of what is now China. And the people who lived in the southern part of China never abandoned the sea, never really gave it up. They were always very interested in it, either for fishing or for travel or for communication with the outside world. It was the Han government's preoccupation with sort of Central Asian raiders, though, that forced them to look to the north and to the west. So that's a very geographic thing. Superimposed on that, you had Confucian ideology, which wanted, it wasn't per se against maritime endeavor or enterprise, but there was a very important family component that you stayed near your parents. There was a great deal of it's a very rooted and domesticated philosophy, if you will. And so the idea of traveling is really sort of antithetical to what the Confucians were all about. That's not uniquely Confucian. There were lots of people in Rome and in Greece. Plato and Aristotle hated the idea of maritime commerce. They thought you should build your cities away from the sea to keep alien influences at bay. Tiberius, the emperor, Roman emperor, was against the exportation of Roman silver and precious metals to India for trinkets and perfumes and exotic animals. So the Chinese aren't really different in that respect, but there was this tension constantly between their coasts and their inland borders. As they were gradually, the center of Han culture was forced farther and farther east and south, though, they opened up in terms of their government appreciation of the sea and embrace of it. They opened up to the idea of using trade as a way of raising money for taxes and that sort of thing. And they were prepared to a certain extent to understand the sea as a space, a trading space, because they had been exploiting the waters of the world, their world, with canals and so on, for centuries, since well into the first millennium BC. So they had an idea about how to use boats and what the advantages were. They didn't really become a sort of expansionist power in any sense until a non-Chinese dynasty came on the throne, the Yuan, the Mongols, under Kublai Khan. And he launched a naval attack on Vietnam, with whom they've always had terrible relations, or mostly fraught relations, let's say. He also invaded Japan twice, and he also invaded Java, which is a good 2,000 miles away. Basically, I think Kublai Khan sort of looked at the ocean as a sort of an extension of the steppe, sort of a broad, flat, open space with broad horizons that had people on the other end who had resources that you could take. It didn't work out that well. But Chinese traders were extremely active in the trade to to Korea, to a certain extent to Japan and the Ryukyu Islands, to the Philippines, throughout Southeast Asia. There were Chinatowns all over the place very, very early on. That's not sort of a phenomenon that happened in San Francisco and New York. So there's been this tension, and I think we make a huge mistake when we sort of think that China is sort of just finding its way at sea. Obviously, they've got ambitions now that are quite consonant with what we tend to think of as the traditional reason for having a fleet. They have an enormous merchant marine, and they want to protect it. We have an enormous navy and no merchant marine to speak of to protect. We protect our trade, but that's a much more nebulous concept than it was in sort of mercantilist age.
That's a good segue to the next question, because in the introduction you write, the merchant marine and naval services no longer hold the attraction for people that they once did. Why'd you write that?
Well, because as I said at the beginning of the talk, that one of the things that I found fascinating growing up was there was a lot of interest in these maritime things. People I had family members who remembered taking ocean liners to Europe as a matter of course. People took ferries, say up, the coast of Maine was, all ferries all the time until they built Route 1, which changed the dynamic of that state enormously, because all of the peninsulas had been connected at their tips by coastal navigation, and then Route 1 ran up along the base of the peninsulas and cut them all off from civilization. Huge, huge change in the way the world appeared. And so we didn't have night ferries from Boston to New York to Bar Harbor. We didn't have transatlantic ocean liners. We didn't even have cruising that much for about 20 or 30 years. Now the irony is people say, well, there's no more passenger ships. But I've seen estimates of between 12 and 20 million people a year going to sea on cruise ships. And the Chinese market, by the way, is just opening up, so that's going to change enormously very soon. At its height, I would say probably 2.5 million people probably traveled by sea in any given year on transatlantic or trans-Pacific or Indian Ocean routes in the heyday of the ocean liner. But when you take all of those sailors and you create ships of such enormous efficiency that you only need crews of 12 to 20 people to man them, and you don't need huge gangs of stevedores and longshoremen in your port cities working on the waterfront and making the waterfronts very sketchy places. But when you turn them all into sort of Fells Point, you've got a completely different understanding about our relationship to the sea. So although commerce at sea has quadrupled in the last 40 years, the number of people actually engaged in that work has stayed the same or has shrunk. And where they do their work has been moved to places far removed from the centers of the cities that were built on maritime commerce. There's no shipping industry to speak of in London. There's no shipping industry to speak of in Manhattan. There's no shipping industry to speak of in any of the major ports, or not any of the major ports, but many of the major ports. I think New Orleans is a big exception, but even their port seems to be farther upriver than it used to be.
I think we have time for a few questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
If anybody? Jim?
Lincoln, would you say that it's prerequisite for a great empire to have a maritime connection?
I don't. The question is whether I think it's imperative for a great empire to have a maritime connection, and I don't think it is. Austria-Hungary comes to mind. Certainly the Central Asian Empire of the Khans, they didn't really have a very significant maritime component. Although, to be fair, when we think about Marco Polo, he spent 20-something years in China, but a quarter of his book is devoted to the 2-year trip he took back by sea, escorting a Chinese princess to the Ilkhan court. So clearly they had a, if things were so great by land, why would the Khans send somebody by sea, a much longer route, but presumably much safer and probably more dignified? But no, I don't think that there is necessarily and certainly if you look at any of the ancient Mesoamerican empires, they did not have the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans. Very sophisticated societies didn't have any maritime component really to speak of.
Other questions? All right, for the folks who are watching this, or will watch it next week, book is Sea and Civilization, Maritime History of the World by Lincoln Paine. Lincoln, thanks for coming to the Naval Academy.
Thanks
Appreciate
very
it.
much, Claude. Really appreciate it. Thank you.